get at the big idea of a whole nonfiction text? In this lesson, you will learn how to get at the big idea of a nonfiction text by stopping at new information and asking, is this adding to an idea I already have, or is it giving me a new idea? Let's review. We already know some things about growing ideas. We know that we can think, I'm wondering, or this makes me think, and that helps us grow our own ideas about a text. Now let's talk about a common mistake. Some students don't put the pieces together. They read one section and they leave it there. They read another section and they leave it there. They grow an idea in the beginning, they grow an idea in the end, and they don't put all of those sections and ideas together to get at the big idea of the whole text. So let's take a look at this middle section of our text. Talk of an invasion. Last month you pretended you weren't listening when the family's oldest son announced that Yankees had invaded Virginia and he was leaving home to fight them. You figured out that Yankees meant Northerners. And you pretended not to care when the master told the family that thousands more Yankee soldiers had come to Fort Monroe and that they had camps outside the fort too. The frightened faces around the table told you that the fort and those soldiers were nearby, and you wondered what would happen next and what it would mean to you. What happened next was important to slaves throughout the South. 3 slaves seeking freedom fled to Fort Monroe. The Union commander there decided that the U.S. law that runaway slaves must be returned to their masters had no effect in Confederate Virginia, so he refused to return the men to their master. Instead, he let them stay at the fort and work for the Union Army. Alright, so I was reading this section of text, and I can think to myself now, does this give me a new idea, or does it add to an idea I already have? Well, if I think back to an earlier section of this text, the first section was all about what life was like for slaves, and it really just made me think that life was really hard for slaves. So I think this is kind of adding to that first idea. This makes me think life was so hard that some slaves ran away even if they didn't know what would happen next. So I had the idea from the first section of text that life was really hard for slaves. And then when I read this section, I was able to add to that idea. Life was so hard that slaves ran away even if they didn't know what would happen next. Okay, let's take a look at another section. Fleeing to safety. By June, whole families of slaves were making their way to Fort Monroe. As word spread, more and more slaves took refuge in Union camps. They probably worked as hard there as they had on the plantations, maybe even harder. Their living conditions were usually crowded and unhealthful, and the soldiers thought of them as property, just as their owners had. They were called contrabands, or items taken from the enemy. So if you had found your way from the plantation to Fort Monroe in June 1861, your life would still be hard, and you still wouldn't be free. But you would have taken an important step toward freedom. So again, I can think to myself, does this give me a new idea, or does it add to an idea I already have? Well, I think this is giving me a new idea, because I thought that life usually got better for slaves after they ran away from their plantations. But this says that the Union soldiers still thought of them as property, just like their owners had, and that they had crowded and unhealthful living conditions. So this is making me think life was just as hard after running away as it was on a plantation. So readers, here are the steps we followed. 1. Stop at new information. 2. Ask, is this adding to an idea I already have or giving me a new idea? In this lesson, you have learned how to get at the big idea of a nonfiction text by stopping at new information and asking, is this adding to an idea I already have, or is it giving me a new idea?